Syracuse, New York. ESF is one of the nation's premier colleges focusing on the study of the environment. Dr. Cohen conducts research in support of conservation and management of wildlife, including the breeding of piping plovers. Please welcome Dr. Cohen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to come here tonight and talk about piping plovers. They're also near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to talk a little bit first before I start about my own background with them. First, I want to acknowledge my partner in crime, Dr. Allison Kosek. She's my postdoc. Some of you might know her. She also is on the board and is the past president of Onondaga Audubon, and she really is the coordinator of the Eastern Lake Ontario Piping Plover Working Group, which I'll talk about a little later. This is her talk, and she's given it several times, and you're seeing me give it for the first time, so hopefully I will make her proud. So my first experience with piping plovers was in 1998. I just finished my master's, and I was a plover monitor for Mass Audubon in Duxbury, Massachusetts. So walking the beach every day, looking after the pairs and trying to find the nests and that kind of thing. Didn't know at that point that they would be a part of my life forever. But for a couple of years after that, I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey in Maryland, Patuxent Wildlife, what used to be Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. Now it's Eastern Ecological Research Center. Not doing plover stuff. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me better now? Okay. So let me just bring this a little closer. So yeah, after working for a couple of years for the USGS, I decided I wanted to get back into, I was working for an ecotoxicologist, and I decided I wanted to get back into endangered species, and I found Professor Jim Fraser at Virginia Tech, who was doing work on piping plovers in a couple different places. So my PhD I did with him at Virginia Tech, but my research site was in the Hamptons on Long Island. So I got into the Hamptons through the back door. And so I was studying the breeding biology of piping plovers and the effect of natural and man-made changes to the beach on their breeding success. And then I stayed there for a few years doing a postdoc, and while there, we did a study on winter ecology in North Carolina, where we were radio tracking plovers to study their winter movements and survival. And then happened to be there when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill took place. So the last thing I was working on there was this huge Gulf coast-wide effort to monitor the effects of the oil spill on the piping plovers. So I called almost, I think, every landowner from the Florida Keys to Galveston, Texas, trying to get permission for our crews to go there and do our work. And so became a professor at ESF in 2011, and I've had grad students working on piping plovers, looking at factors that limit their success in New Jersey, Cape Cod. I had another student studying the closely related snowy plovers down in Florida, and then a host of other things. So salt marsh sparrows. Allison Kosek's actual PhD was on salt marsh sparrows in New York City, and then forest songbirds, and then one mammal, the New England cottontail, is my only non-bird that I've had research on. That they live in east of the Hudson River in New York and then up to Maine. So that is me. The title is Efforts to Maintain a Newly Colonized Piping Plover Population on Lake Ontario, but I'm going to start, the first half of the presentation is going to be much broader than that, talking about the conservation of the species in the whole Great Lakes and those efforts, and then I will talk about how what we're doing in Eastern Lake Ontario fits into that. With all ESF presentations, we begin with this land acknowledgement. So I acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the Great Lakes dune systems, and may we keep them in our hearts and minds as we discuss issues affecting their ancestral homelands. And several tribes are partners in the piping plover recovery effort in different parts of the Great Lakes. Okay, so just a little bit about the species. A lot of you may know this, but for those who don't know much about their biology, there are 3 breeding populations of piping plovers in North America. So the northern Great Plains population and the Atlantic coast population are protected as threatened under federal law. And then our population in the Great Lakes is endangered. So in the Great Plains, the birds nest along the prairie potholes in Canada. And then they also nest on sandbars in the Missouri River and the Platte River. And so the habitat structure is kind of similar to what they nest on the beaches, it's just the landscape is quite different. On the Atlantic coast, they nest on beaches and barrier islands from Prince Edward Island down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They used to historically nest down to South Carolina, but haven't since pretty early in the 20th century. And then our population of the Great Lakes, nesting on our lake shores. And so, oops, what's going on? I think I hit the wrong key there. Okay. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to hit the key. So in blue here, you see the winter range. So even though we have 2 threatened populations and 1 endangered population in the breeding grounds, all 3 of them come together in the winter. So the wintering range is from the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which is the only place that has plovers year round. Not the same plovers, so the ones from further north come down and the ones that nest here go south. So the southeast coast of the United States, the Caribbean, we know there's a big population in the Bahamas that a few lucky people have got to go study. And then we have the Gulf Coast of the United States and around to the Yucatan. The Great Lakes birds, by and large, winter on the southeast coast of the United States and the Bahamas, but we do get some on the Gulf Coast. And as I said, you can find birds from all 3 populations in these different spots. But it's pretty rare for them to change their breeding locations, but not totally unheard of. Okay, so focusing now on the Great Lakes. So historically, it's sort of, I'd say guesstimated, because there weren't any like systematic surveys, just naturalist accounts of how many were here and there, believed to be anywhere from 500 to 800 pairs in the whole Great Lakes. And about half of them were on the eastern Great Lakes. So you can see, again, from naturalist notes, a breakdown of 50 to 100 in Ohio, Pennsylvania, which just has a very small shoreline on the lakes, obviously, only a few. In New York, we had some on the eastern end, 24 to 30 pairs, and then Ontario had a good number of them. This is all from a paper, Russell 1983, where he compiled all those notes. And sadly, by 1983, there was almost no piping plovers left in the Great Lakes anywhere. So at one point, they were down to 12 nesting pairs, all of them in upper Michigan. And absolutely none on the eastern Great Lakes. So here are censuses from the late 70s and early 80s, and only unmated males coming through in Ontario. So more or less gone really by the 50s, but I think, as I show later, there was one attempt to nest in the early 1980s, and that was the very last time in New York. So reasons for the decline, and maybe you've heard this sad story before, but it really depended on the era. But originally, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, that was the era of market hunting, and so pretty much anything that raised its head, they would shoot, and they would send it to market for food, and in the case of birds, feathers for the hat trade. And so most species of wildlife, especially waterbird life, was exhibited sharp declines. And that luckily all came to an end with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918. The loss of the birds was really one big driving factor. The shorebirds was a big factor driving that law. And so we saw populations begin to recover. But then for these species that live on beaches, in around the 1950s, which is considered like the era of tourism, people discovered how much they love the beach. And so building houses on it, driving on it, and coming to it in large numbers. And with people and their housing developments and so forth come the human commensal predators that like to accompany people, feeding on food waste and living in structures that people put up. In addition, of course, to the domestic animals like cats and dogs. So all of these would pose threat to birds. And once again, we saw all these coastal birds begin to decline starting in the 1950s on the Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes. Okay, so So you can see the places that plovers like to be are the same places that people like to be, and this does cause some conservation conflict. So this actually is an area showing not ideal plover habitat, but what a lot of the beaches look like. So fairly narrow. So the plovers nest on the ground. They just make a shallow scrape in the sand. Sometimes they line it with pebbles or bits of shell or whatever. But piping plovers, they like to be out in the open and see predators coming. So they rely on their camouflage. And so places that become overgrown like this, if it's vegetated to this degree, they sort of change their behavior and start hiding their nests in clumps of vegetation rather than putting it out in the open. But then if it gets much denser than this, they just move out. And they can't stay there anymore. They also need to have some sort of wet areas nearby because they forage on intertidal invertebrates and terrestrial arthropods, insects, and that kind of thing. So the wet areas produce food, and that's where they usually spend their time feeding. So they need sand next to wet areas and very sparsely vegetated. And they prefer to be farther from the tree line because the trees are where the aerial predators will perch. And this is sort of more optimal habitat that you'd find in the lakes. So they really like both on the coast, Atlantic coast, and on the Great Lakes. They like the ends of islands and they like inlets between two islands where water is flowing in and out, because there you get very dynamic landscapes with wet areas that maybe get wet on the coastal areas, of course, tidal, and here driven by wind and storms and, well, human management of the waterways as well, raises and lowers the Great Lakes. And so at the ends of islands, you tend to get these big open areas of sand next to wet spots. And so plovers they like inlets, but so do people. So once again, you can see all these boats here, and it's a management problem in a lot of places. Like, how do we let the people come and enjoy it and give the plovers their space? So here this is a picture from the coast just to show you sort of the natural processes that historically maintained plover habitat. Really, research has shown that they relied a lot on coastal storms that would knock back the vegetation, flatten dunes, and then make these. So here we see, this is a picture of Fire Island in New York after Hurricane Sandy. So a new inlet was created here. And then these are called overwash fans. So where sand was deposited by storm action across the island, and even created some of these sandy corridors connecting one side of the island to the other, giving something like a plover chick multiple places where it could go and feed unimpeded. And so processes like this would also operate on Great Lakes Barrier Islands historically and create new habitat. So plovers, as we've learned, they like to come in on a new area that's been created. The population grows, they do well for a while, vegetation comes in, predators find it, whatever, and then they move on to the next storm damage or whatever. But now human beings, they work hard to try to prevent this sort of thing from happening because there's a concern that when these islands breach or whatever, that it could threaten human infrastructure on the mainland that these barrier islands protect. So we're left with, in a few places, so like in this case, Fire Island, the National Park Service has a natural processes creed, so they don't try to repair these kinds of things. But if it happens in other places, they do tend to pump sand onto the beaches and try to fix it quickly. And so we're looking for options like habitat restoration to try to mimic these conditions that the birds like, since they're not being created naturally so much anymore. And this is a map showing at Assateague Island, where we see the progression of ecological succession happening. So here's the island area right after a storm. This would be the Atlantic Ocean, and this would be a bay on the other side. And these triangles were plover nests, and you see they're nesting all over the place, close to where the good foraging is here on the bay side. The dark stuff is vegetation. Ecological succession happens, and if there's no more storms, and what they did at Assateague is they built a really big high dune here to prevent storms from doing that again. And so by 2008, the vegetation's grown in, the plovers are nesting in a long line. Most of them can't take their chicks across to this area to feed, so they're stuck feeding on whatever they have over here. And also foxes have a nice straight line of plover nests to walk along and other predators and pick off. So that's a problem. And in fact, so a lot of studies now, including my own students, Michelle Stanchel work in New Jersey, showed that really access to high quality foraging areas on both sides of these barrier islands is critical for supporting chicks, the survival of plover chicks. So here's just a cartoon of an area where you have unimpeded access from the ocean side to the bay side, and the birds can feed at different times of the day. There's not much human disturbance, especially on the bay side. So these chicks grow in 3 weeks, and the faster they grow, the sooner they're safe from predators because they can fly. And here's a more typical situation on the Atlantic coast where on this side you've got vegetation, so they can't cross over. They do eat insects in the grass, but there's just not as high a density there, and they're harder to catch. And then lots of people, so that chicks are, they don't go down to the water because it's scary. And so here they take a little bit longer to grow and to be able to fly. And so this is a big determinant of what proportion of these chicks are going to make it to fledging. All right, so this is the context for the plover population for the whole Great Lakes. So here, as I mentioned, they were down to 12 pairs at one point. They were listed as endangered in 1986. I'm going to talk about these different management options in a minute, but basically management began in earnest in 1988 to 1990, and the population began to slowly grow. There's a couple of management actions I'm going to talk about, so nest exclosures and captive rearing. But the main point is, as we can see, if you list a species as endangered, and if you invest lots of time and money in it, you can have a successful story. But it's not easy. It does take a lot of people caring and putting effort into it. And so as of the late 2020, the early 2020s, we have anywhere from 65 to 75 pairs in the Great Lakes, depending on the year. And so this means that when we started to get into the 2010s, we suddenly are producing young that can spread out maybe back to some of the other places in the Great Lakes. So here's a couple, there's 3 things in the Great Lakes that were really done. And one I don't really have a slide for, but that is just putting up fencing to create disturbance-free areas for the plover. So if you've gone to the beaches on the Western Great Lakes, you have seen this. If you've gone to the Atlantic coast, you've seen it. They call it symbolic fencing on the Atlantic coast, and they call it psychological fencing on the Great Lakes because it's nothing that's going to block you from going anywhere. It's just a piece of string between 2 poles with some sign saying, don't go in here. And people mostly don't. Not everybody obeys it, but most people do. And so that's been a huge, and it's been found that even so, if you put that up in places that look good and plover's never been there, they often will start to show up because they just need that little space, really. So these other 2 strategies that have been very helpful are nest exclosures. So this is just a cage that they put over the nest. And plovers, of course, can fly, but being shorebirds, they run around a lot. So they run in and out. And here's a nighttime trail camera photo of a fox. So ideally, the predators can't get in. And this strategy has been shown to increase the hatching of nests by at least doubling in many cases. Some places you can't get nest to hatch unless you do this. It does not protect the chicks. So sometimes you can produce all the chicks you want out of these exclosures and then they don't fledge because there's predators, in which case you need to do something else that's less popular sort of with a lot of the public, like removing that predators. And also sometimes certain predators, especially some aerial predators, start to recognize these exclosures and hunt the birds as they come out, and then suddenly the trade-off starts to tip, and so in some cases they can't be used, or if that's happening, maybe some other action to control the predator populations has to happen. Captive rearing is something that's really unique to the Great Lakes strategy. So they began doing this in the early 1990s, where if a nest got abandoned, so once in a while plovers abandon a nest if there's high disturbance, but more often than not, if a nest is abandoned, something probably happened to one of the adults, and then the other member of the pair, they're monogamous, so they don't really want to raise the nest on their own. The males generally, in the Great Lakes, the males generally raise the chicks on their own, so the female leaves after about a week, and he takes care of that, but he will not sit on the eggs by himself if she disappears, by and large. So if a nest got abandoned, they took it into captivity, or if they knew that a nest might flood or something, they took it into captivity, hatch it out, raise them, and then put them back before the end of the season so they can migrate. And in the beginning, well, for the first 10 or 15 years, they put them back when they couldn't quite fly perfectly yet. I think the idea was that they might imprint on this area and remember it and come back. And so there were 347 captive release chicks and over all these years since 1992, and 2,615 that we know of that fledged in the wild. So it's a pretty big boost to the population that would have got lost otherwise. So 13.3%. But putting fledglings in the wild doesn't mean that they will join the population. They have to survive until they can leave for migration. They have to survive another whole year and come back. So there was a question: was this how much were they really contributing to the population? So this was a paper by Aaron Roche that came out in 2008. And these lines show annual survival from 0% and up to the top of 70%. So this would mean 70% of the chicks survived the whole year at the very top. And the gray ones were captive reared, and you can see they survived much less well than birds that, and so they know this because they were banding every single wild and that chick they could get their hand on, as well as the captive ones, of course. So so the wild reared ones survived much better, so 30 to 60%, depending on the year, but only 10 to 20% of the captive reared. So they were contributing to the population, just not as much as they wanted to. And so this work is work now that I've been engaged with Allison and Dr. Francie Cuthbert, who's been out of University of Minnesota, who's been leading the recovery effort along with the Fish and Wildlife Service and her state partners ever since the late 80s when it was listed, and she's still going strong today. So she is working with us with the current data to look at whether, so a few years ago, they changed their methods to release the birds back into the wild only after they could fly quite well. And so the question was this helping at all? So we analyzed the data. We predicted that the captive reared birds would still have lower survival than the wild ones, but be better. And we also wanted to look at how well they nested when they came back. Were they as good at raising young as the wild reared ones? So don't worry about the statistical model that we used, but we did a model where we looked at survival by age class. So hatch year birds to their first year of breeding, and then older birds, how well did they do? So if a captive reared bird made it through 1 year, how well did they do after that? We looked at males and females separately, and then the origins, captive and wild reared. So this shows the survival probabilities. And so I'm showing you just a little bit at a time. So here are females. So let's look at the hatch year female. So first of all, we can see that the difference between wild reared and captive reared is definitely gotten better. And here the average for the captive reared was, was around 30%, which is much better than the 10 to 20 that there were before. And then if they make it through that year, and then afterwards, their survival bumps up to like a normal adult survival level. Close to 75% of the adults would survive the year. With the males, though, something else was going on. So the captive reared males had the best survival of any chicks. So they released them, they came back the next year, they survived. But then after that, they died. So it's very strange. The adults should do well. And this stuff's hot off the press. I haven't published yet. This is our analyses we're doing now. Our guess, hypothesis is that maybe they're having either trouble finding a place to nest, a territory, and so they're wandering around. And we know that when birds wander around and can't find a territory, they tend to die. Or they do try to nest and something gets them on the breeding ground, so they don't survive the breeding season. So whether that's happening, we don't know, but it's something we want to look at. Whereas the wild males are doing fine. And then we looked at site fidelity. So there's lots of people re-sighting color-banded piping plovers in the winter. And that helps us with our modeling, because now we know if we don't see a bird come back to the Great Lakes to breed, but someone keeps seeing it in Florida year after year, we know it's alive. It just might emigrate to somewhere else. In general, plovers are very site faithful. So here's the adult males and females, and you can see that if they survive the year for captive reared birds, so for the females, about 80% of them come back to the place they were released from. And for males, about 76. And for the wild reared birds, like almost certain to come back to where they had nested the year before. Juveniles, this is natal site philopatry. So again, pretty high. So captive reared males and females, very likely to come back to the place that they had been released from the year before. And wild reared birds, a little more likely to disperse from where they hatched, but still pretty likely to come back. Okay, and then as I mentioned, we wanted to look at how well they kept their nests alive. And again, we broke it down by juveniles and adults. And this time we put whether or not the nest was exposed as one factor, because we know that just keeps the predators off and should make them do better. So this is a very busy graph, but one thing to point out is these arrows show the difference between exposed nests. So here's the survival probability of a nest for the entire 34 days that it should be on the ground. So they lay for 6 days, one egg every other day, and then they incubate for 28. So we can see that survival for that 34-day period is much worse if they don't expose the nest than if they do. And then besides that, we can see that for these females, for adult females, if they were captive reared, they weren't as good at keeping their nest alive as the wild reared females. But for the males, there was not much of a difference. Why that is, we're not sure at all. There is a little bit of a division of labor, so it's not perfect, but the females tend to incubate more during the day and males at night. So if it's different threats or what, I'm not really sure, but these are things we're still looking into. Okay, I already pointed out those. Okay, so conclusions from this sort of range-wide demographic analysis was that captive reared birds survive about as well as wild reared birds, except for those after second-year older males. So something's happening to them. So they do come back and breed once, and then after that something happens. So that's a concern. Hatch-year captive reared birds are very likely to return to the site they were released to. So that's interesting. Obviously, maybe we could just find beaches that seem like they should support plovers and they haven't found them yet or whatever, and then use that as captive release sites, and the birds will maybe come back to them and try to breed. And of course, it will be, there's some risk because we won't know whether the conditions are good for reproduction at those sites yet, since plovers haven't tried it out since the 1950s. But and then once again, as we tend to find, we find that exclosures are a good tool for improving nest survival. Okay. So going back now to try to make the link to what's happening in New York right now. So again, the population was really low. There was none in the Eastern Great Lakes at all. And then right around here, the population grows and they're producing a lot of young, both from the wild and through their captive rearing program. And in 2015, I'm happy to say we had our first nesting attempt in New York since 1984, and that was the first attempt they'd had since the 50s. So really a dramatic recolonization event. None of us expected it to happen, and I was super excited because it was only an hour from where I work, and I love piping plovers, and now I had one pretty close by. So I said, let's go study that piping plover. So it actually, they had 2 nest attempts that year. Funny things happen in very small populations. These birds were brother and sister, as they know from the banding data. But they produced young, and the young seemed to do okay. So the first nest they had, so this was Lakeview Wildlife Management Area. It's a DEC-owned wildlife management area in Jefferson County. Their first nest got lost to predators, and then they made a second one. And when I first saw it, I couldn't believe it because the beach looked very narrow. You can't see it from this photo, but the tree line is pretty close, covered in debris. And in fact, the DEC had to put sandbags out to stop a flooding event from washing out the eggs. But their intervention succeeded. I think that they saw the water was coming, and it was only a couple days till hatch. So they wanted their birds. So they sandbagged it, and it worked. So I went up with my postdoc at the time, and we banded the chicks, and they both fledged. And so this is what kind of happened from that point on. So this is the Eastern Lake Ontario breeding area. So the red dots are piping plover nest sites. The orange is Lakeview Wildlife Management Area, and the blue is Sandy Island Beach State Park. And there's a couple other sites that we look at, but haven't had any plovers yet. So the first pair nested at the north end of Lakeview and then lost their nest, and then they succeeded at the south end. and then they fledged 2 chicks. The next year, there were 2 pairs, one at Lakeview, which lost its nest, and then one at Sandy Island Beach, nesting on a pile of sand that had been deposited by people that had been dredged out of the inlet. So nesting on this human-created feature made a nice big pile of sand for them. But they lost all their nest to foxes. The next year was 2017, and the Lake Ontario water levels were so high that there was 0 nesting habitat for them. So we were nervous that they would forget about us during that time. But in 2018, this pair came back. And we've had this same exact pair every year since. We know they're the same because the banding. They did great that year. They hatched 4 eggs and they fledged all 4 of those chicks. They came back again and fledged 2 the next couple of years. So that was through 2020. And so we had some objectives during that time to try to just, you can't really do a graduate student research project on 1 pair of plovers, but we wanted to sort of gather whatever information we could about the habitat they were using, potential threats that might prevent them from limiting, and then also understanding the landscapes and the other beaches around and whether or not they could ever support plovers. So that's what we were determining, factors that might be limiting the expansion of the population in New York, because we wanted it to grow. To work out best management practices and then determine whether or not New York would be contributing to the range-wide recovery of the Great Lakes population. So I had a graduate student who did this exercise comparing the characteristics of piping plover nesting sites in the heart of their range in Michigan to the potential sites that they could go in New York. And New York just does not compare favorably. I mentioned I was very surprised to see them nest where they did. Our beaches are narrow compared to the places they like to nest in Michigan. So 31%, only 5 to 30 feet wide. The primary substrate of the shorelines in Michigan are sand, but we have a lot of artificial shorelines, so bulkheads and things like that wouldn't be suitable for nesting. So we don't have as much area for them. And a lot of the land ownership there is parkland, where the majority where we are is private. So that doesn't mean it's not habitat, although a lot of it was never managed for wildlife. So it looks like this. We have steep scarps here, and then the beach on this side. And it does create opportunities to work with private landowners to try to do management, but it's more complicated than when it's public land. So another thing we did was just sort of look at where this 1 pair was spending its time and what parts of the beach they were using, and to try to help the land managers decide like what they needed to protect and when. And oh, why is that happening? Okay, so these bars show the proportion. So what we did is we walked transects from the water line up to the trees, and we just divided the landscape into these 3 zones: moist sediment habitat, so the wet sand; the upper beach, which is the dry sand; and then the rack, which is the washed up vegetation, because we knew on the Atlantic coast they like to feed on insects in the rack. And so here is what we found on the beach itself. Most of it, of course, was this big dry sand area, some rack, and then here's the proportion that was wet. The adults, they like to spend their time in the rack. So not much rack on the beach, but this is the percent of their time they spent in it. So they really preferred it. And so the young, however, were mostly hanging out in the dry sand on the upper beach. And so they were feeding on insects in the vegetation on the upper beach and resting and taking naps up in the sand and stuff like that. Which means, of course, that all three zones are necessary for the plovers. Okay, so that was our study of 1 pair of birds. But then we wanted to, but some of us, like myself, had a lot of experience with management on the Atlantic coast. And so working with the people who had experience in the Great Lakes, we wanted to put together a strategy for trying to manage the population. So we put together the Eastern Lake Ontario Piping Plover Working Group. This is our cute symbol. And so SUNY ESF, Onondaga Audubon, the DEC. For a while, Audubon New York was a part of it, but that person got a job in a different state. But this year, I hear they're sending someone back our way to join in. So it's their Long Island Plover coordinator who wants to be part of the Great Lakes stuff too. New York State Parks, of course. So the DEC and the state parks are the places where the plovers have the plovers on their land. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Cortland office, the New York office, have been providing a lot of support as well. So we talk, we have a pre-season meeting, and then we coordinate with each other for data collection, and we all work together to monitor the birds and to conduct management activities. So the kinds of stuff that we do, so we work together, we put up nest exclosures at the beginning of the season or whenever there's a nest. We have cameras on the beach looking at the predator communities, and USDA goes and helps remove foxes. And we know that without that, we would have a lot more difficulty hatching our, or probably fledging our chicks, because there's a lot of foxes. Although this photo is not from a camera, it's by Matt Brown, who's a photographer who's out there all the time and who's been really invaluable getting pictures of things and helping to monitor the situation. Public education. So the state park has staff, they put tables on the beach and they talk to the public. So this was all very new to the public. So, working the Atlantic coast, I can tell you that, plovers are the cutest animal to have a PR problem of all time. So when you put up symbolic fencing and you rope off beach and people see they don't have access, or you tell them they can't drive on the beach and this and that, they blame the bird and they get angry because they don't see that. Most people don't see it. It's camouflage. So it's sort of a mystery that's just irritating them. And so we wanted to get ahead of the curve when we only had one pair and just start talking to people and meeting the local community. And then advocacy, again, working with the agencies to try to make sure that activities on the beach don't happen in a way that affects the birds. So right here, so this is the Sandy Island Beach Inlet. And this is the dredging operation they do every year to maintain it for boat access between Sandy Pond and Lake Ontario. And so the agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service says they can't do it when the plovers are there. They're supposed to do it in March. But if you were reading the news last, 2021, you may have seen how this made the news because they didn't get their permit on time, and they started trying to dredge after the birds showed up. And there is a provision for them doing that as long as there's actually they can't, there's supposed to be a monitor if they do it after April 1st to make sure the birds hadn't showed up, but the birds did. And they couldn't dredge, and the lake water levels were very low, and so boats were having a hard time. So they had their US congressperson come, and that person went on the floors of Congress and said the Endangered Species Act had to be changed. And I was like, and at that point we had 2 pairs of plovers. I said we didn't really make it very far before all this started to happen. And then law enforcement. So usually state park police and sometimes additional law enforcement come and try to encourage people to keep their dogs on leashes and stay out of this fencing area and all that. And, okay, so another thing that we wanted to do is try to, at Lakeview Wildlife Management Area, I mentioned that in 2017, the water level went so high up that the habitat kind of went away. And then by 2021, it had come back. And the lake levels went down, so there was a lot of sand. But in the meantime, a lot of the areas, this old overwash area had become totally vegetated. So we got some money to do habitat restoration, and so we took down some trees right adjacent to the beach and cleared out the herbaceous vegetation. We spread some coarse material on the substrate because they like to have gravel and shells around because it helps them camouflage their nest. And then we used some rakes to just try to take some of those steeper slopes out. And then down at so this was at Lakeview at Sandy Island Beach. So there were 2 areas we did this. So this is where the plovers had nested in 2015. So we did a little restoration here, and this is where we did sort of the dune restoration for plovers. At Sandy Island Beach, on the north side here's that channel I was just talking about. They did some accidental habitat restoration for piping plovers. They wanted to put sand here, not for wildlife, but they were worried it was getting too narrow. And actually the Nature Conservancy, but also I think some private interests, put sand here to widen it and wrap the sand around the edge and widen this little spit right here. And so, sorry, I'm gonna get to that next. So what happened with these restorations? So in 2021, so right after, just a month after we restored the habitat, a new pair came to nest at Lakeview. But sadly, so this is where it nested. And sadly, a predator ate the first egg right after they laid it. So they gave up and they flew down to Sandy Island Beach. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So there was the egg, and it did not last more than a day, unfortunately. The plover stewards like to give the birds names, but in 2022, however, a new pair came into that spot and right here, and they nested successfully. And they included a bird that we knew came from captive rearing. So that was really exciting. So they hatched for eggs. and they fledged 2 chicks. And so, but the female had left early, which is what they do, and the male hatched the chicks, but he disappeared when they were only 2 weeks old. So as I was mentioning, that's just anecdotal information, but remember I said we were concerned about these captive reared males, and so it's like, aha, fits in with our hypothesis. But they somehow raised themselves. I guess the older brother took care of the younger one. I mean, they're the same age, but there was one sort of bigger one and one smaller one. Somehow, without any adults protecting them, they made it and they both fledged. In fact, one of them we know ended up in on the Gulf Coast of Florida and was right where the last hurricane smacked into the coast, but then was seen again after the hurricane. So somehow kept himself safe. All right. So Lakeview, so far we have birds using these restored sites. Sandy Island Beach. So when that pair lost their one egg at Lakeview, they flew down and they nested in the accidental restoration at Sandy Island Beach. So we got a nice result there. But it was actually the female, the male and the female came down, and there was another male hanging around, also captive bred bird, and she divorced the male with whom she lost the egg at Lakeview and nested instead with the new guy. And it was, I guess, a good choice because they fledged 2 chicks that year. And these are the 2 that had in 2021 had been there since 2018, still going strong. Although I think they did not fledge any this year. Something happened and we actually found one of the chicks dead and it seemed to have not got enough to eat. But in 2022, they were back and this time they did fledge 1 chick. And this same pair that had colonized this area the year before, the newly married pair, they fledged 3 chicks. So this is the area where, so in 2021 was the year of the controversy over the dredging because the pair nested on this side of the inlet and that side of the inlet, and there was no way they could get dredging equipment in there, and they weren't too happy about that. But in 2022, the dredging was fine, everything was fine, nobody seemed to be mad, so that was great. So our goal, so that the recovery plans said that we should have 3 pairs in Eastern New York based on their habitat assessment from 1996. And we got there, and now I'm very anxious to make sure we get more than 3 pairs just to show them. And so we're looking for other potential, and I think there's room for at least a couple more, maybe at least 1 more in the area we're already managing in. And we're looking at other sites to see if they can be restored. And the other goal is to try to keep a fecundity, which is the number of chicks fledged per pair, between 1.5 and 2. And you can see that we had that 1 bad year in 2021, but mostly we've been at above or at 2, and last year we did it again. So so that means we are producing young that potentially, and I should say the pair that nested last year in 2022 at Lakeview, both of them had hatched at Sandy Island Beach in a prior year. So they're spreading out from that 1 site, and so we're really excited about that. So the restoration sites were both immediately colonized. They were successful nesting in both places. And so our little population is taking hold, we hope. And every year, though, we're very nervous about what will happen, especially since the male disappeared last year. And now, if the female comes back, we'll have to hope another male comes along, assuming he did not make it. So the Great Lakes population is expanding, the fecundity is high, and they respond positively to habitat restoration. So we're hopeful that we can continue that trend going. And so, of course, since we're in the neighborhood, I just wanted to point out this other restoration that wasn't for piping plovers, was for marsh restoration, but did apparently create foraging habitat, because we do get reports every year. I haven't actually been here, but Allison has, and she said the substrate isn't really designed for nesting piping plovers, but if anyone has ideas for how anything could be altered to attract them, because usually we find, like, if they like to feed there, if there's nesting habitat, there's a chance eventually they would nest. So we'd love to hear from anyone who has ideas about how to potentially get another nesting pair somewhere. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
In the areas where there are many more, how long do you live?
So they tend to live 5 to 6 years. Some of them we know have lived like 14 or 15. So there's a famous one that was in Michigan, and every year it was for 15 years, it was in Michigan during the breeding season and Marco Island, Florida on the Gulf Coast in the wintertime. So it just went back and forth between those two places. So yeah, they have very high site fidelity to their winter location as well as their breeding location. Yes.
I know these are closely related to killdeer.
Yeah.
Is there habitat competition between those two species, or are the killdeer more of an upland?
No, there is. Yeah, killdeer. It's one of those things where like killdeer are kind of considered a problem for piping plovers, but at the same time, you know, no one wants to consider them a villain because they're a native plover as well. So actually that year 2017, when the water levels were really high, a killdeer nested at Sandy Island Beach, but no piping plovers. But you know, on the Atlantic coast, the killdeer will nest out on the barrier island too. They tend to nest maybe in a little coarser substrate and denser grass, but they're really mean to piping plovers. So if the chicks of the piping plovers come through a killdeer territory, it just attacks them pretty mercilessly. So yeah, they definitely compete. Yes.
One of the adult birds looked like he had problems with his toe.
Oh, you know, yeah. So I didn't go into that, but it's a long story, an interesting one. So I can go back to where. No. That him? Well, I don't know if I'll find it again, but yes, there's a bird that was so that was the 2022 chick. And it was, you remember I mentioned those two birds that that raised themselves without their parents for half the time. So when they were really young, one of the chicks got separated from the brood. At that time, I think there was 4 chicks still, or 3. And so eventually it was kind of moribund in the dunes. And I think the dune stewards went and like warmed it up and reunited it. And a couple of days later, it seemed fine and was with them again. And then a couple of days after that, it was limping, but it had all its toes. And then it was always, you know, if you looked at it developmentally, it always looked like it was at least 5 days younger than it actually was compared to its sibling. So when I said like the older one raised the younger one, I really meant was like the healthy one raised the other one. So, and then they, at the end of this, but they both fledged, they both could fly, and the limping went away. But that particular bird was seen in North Carolina during migration, and that's, I think, New Jersey and then North Carolina, and that's when they saw the toes were missing. And that was the same bird that went down to Tampa area that was in the hurricane. So that bird is like seen wherever it goes, and somehow it seems to be a survivor, even though it's had some bad luck with its health. And we don't know why it lost its toes or anything, but obviously something happened to it.
So it wasn't that disease that we've heard. I mean, it's like a kind of like leprosy, where some of the smaller birds get to lose toes and feet.
Yeah, I mean, I think since no one ever caught the bird to try to get any sort of sample, we have no idea why, but it could be like any number of things. But it seemed to be disease, like didn't seem like something injured it. So I've seen on the Atlantic coast, plovers lose toes and legs, and it's a lot of time it's mechanical injury. In certain parts of the range, they get attacked by ghost crabs. So, or they get fishing line wound around their feet. But in this case, it seemed to probably be something disease related, but we don't really know what it was. So yeah, it'd be good to know, but yes.
Quite clear on exclosures. Is the mesh size big enough to let the birds go through, but small enough to keep out foxes and skunks and raccoons?
Right. So the birds can easily walk in and out through the mesh. The top is soft bird netting, so if they happen to fly up and bump their head, it wouldn't cause injury. But so what you do is you dig a trench about 1 foot deep, as a lesson that was learned over the years, because otherwise foxes and skunks and raccoons will dig down under. So you bury it about 1 foot down, and then yeah, the birds can walk in and out, and the predators can't get in. But you know, so some of the problems that arise, so on the Atlantic coast, in places where they have feral cats, cats will just walk around and around and around them. So it's always like an arms race. So sometimes people will put like wings on them to try to stop them from circling. And then the real problem is really owls and hawks can just like wait and then pounce on birds when they come out. So we've caught that on camera for a snowy plover in Florida where Cooper's hawk jumped on the female when she came out. So there's actually a lot of research that I was involved with on where's the tipping point between protecting nests and looting some adults, and when is it not worth it anymore. So, but no one wants to lose it forever as a tool, because it's, you know, it's been hugely important in getting eggs to hatch.
All right, I've got 3 questions that came in online. The first is from Dominic, asking, is the population stable or increasing on the eastern coast?
It's increasing on the East Coast. So last 2 years, so the recovery goal for the Atlantic coast is 2,000 pairs. There's several recovery goals, but the abundance one is 2,000 pairs, and they hit that 2 years ago for the first time. But the other goal was to have it distributed amongst the north, middle, and south of the coast, and that didn't happen. So New York and north is really contributing the most, and Massachusetts itself has 1,100 pairs, and New York hit its goal for the first time last year, but New Jersey and South are not doing great. The one notable place is Delaware, which had 6 pairs for most of the last 30 years, and then they did a habitat restoration project at Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge, and now it's like booming with plovers. They never had plovers inside the Delaware Bay before. So another example of creating habitat, and they'll come. Virginia had was doing very well until 5 or 10 years ago, and suddenly, with no real explanation, the plovers started to decline a lot. And those beaches, if you've never been to the Virginia coast, most of it's accessible by boat, like north of the Chesapeake Bay. It's all kind of like the only wild coast we have. In the Atlantic, it's boat accessible only, and the Nature Conservancy owns a lot of it. So why this is happening? But they trap predators. So, but sea level rise, I think, is affecting a lot of those low-lying islands. So probably something with habitat, but just a hypothesis from some of the modeling I've seen.
Great. Question from Amy. Originally, the island at Braddock Bay was designed with sand, which then washed away. If it were replaced, do you think we might get a breeding pair?
So I'm not really a coastal geologist, so I don't know. Like what I know is if you put sand at the right elevation and it's near foraging habitat, there's a good chance they'll be attracted to it. And as far as the engineering part, if it washed away once, then you're going to have to keep doing it probably, because and so whether it's worth, I would love to see a nesting pair at that site, but if the sand doesn't stay there in a stable way, but if there's a dredging project every year that has the right grain of sand and you just plop it there, then maybe it would be economical if you're dredging anyways. So yeah, we've definitely learned that on the Atlantic coast and now in the Great Lakes that plover habitat requirements are pretty simple. They need sand that doesn't wash away, and they need it to be near wet areas to forage, and they need some area free from disturbance, and that pretty much does it for them. It seems like, as you control the predators. So.
Great. One more question here from Scott. Says, if I photograph abandoned bird, how do I report it?
There's a couple of ways. So if you send it to the USGS bird banding lab, they don't keep track of color combinations, but they know who's doing the banding, so they send it to me or to someone else based on the color combinations. They kind of know who it probably was. Then the person they mostly would send it to is named Alice Van Zorn. So she works with Francie Cuthbert at University of Minnesota. So David, like if you want to remind me by email, I can send you like the contact information. So if you send it directly, they would probably tell you more quickly than if you send it to the bird banding lab, like where it came from. You could send it to me too, but we have so many birds that the chance it was, so few rather, the chances it was one of mine would be small, although not zero. Sometimes we get reports of ours from places like, we know that after the breeding season, our female has often gone to Presque Isle in Pennsylvania before she went south. So why she went that way first, you have to ask her. I have no idea. Yeah.
What is the actual breeding time?
So here they start showing up like mid-April, and they start nesting in May, and they're pretty much done by early August. So it's a little narrow. On the Atlantic coast, it's a few weeks earlier. Yes.
Any evidence of bird flu in plover population?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence that they've confirmed that piping plovers have died of bird flu. So we had some mysterious deaths and then they came up negative. There was a famous pair in Chicago. I don't know if everyone's paying attention to that, but so at the same time that we got our pair, Chicago got its first pair in forever, like since the early 1900s. And they were really popular and they were in the news. And then last year, the male died and they collected the carcass and they found it was a fungal infection. So between that and harmful algal blooms and avian botulism and bird flu, there's a lot of potential hazards out there. But the chick that we collected dead a couple years ago, it was negative for everything. They couldn't understand it, seemed to have just not got adequate nutrition and I'm not sure why. It's a rough life out there.
One question and comment from Lynn. Lynn says, I was working in the area of Port Jefferson on Long Island, often during the 90s. They were quite proud of the conservation efforts. Can you comment on the Long Island population's success or otherwise?
Yeah, so if you had asked me, 15 years ago, I would have probably known all the numbers and everything because that's where I had done my PhD. But now I can just say definitely I'd consider it to be successful. It's another partnership between the state. Audubon does a lot of work, and a lot of the towns do their own monitoring, and the state parks do their monitoring, and the National Seashore works with citizen groups to do theirs. And so last year, so the recovery plan for plover is it's not by state. They divided it up into Atlantic Canada, Northern US region, which is New England. It's New England Recovery Unit, not the Northern. New England Recovery Unit, New York, New Jersey Recovery Unit, and the Southern Recovery Unit, which is Delaware down to North Carolina. And so I think the specific recovery goal for New York, New Jersey is 600-ish pairs, and they hit that last year, and pretty much thanks to New York. So New Jersey, they work really hard, and they have about 95 to 100 pairs, and it just doesn't grow. Like sometimes it goes to 120, but then it drops right back down. And so that New Jersey has special challenges. Most of the shore is seawalls. And then where it isn't at the end is sandy spits, but then that's where the people go. So most of they work really hard. They have agreements with the towns to do conservation, and they're holding the population in place pretty well. If they didn't do that, it would probably just go down. But most of New Jersey populations at Holgate National Wildlife Refuge and Gateway National Seashore. I don't know why I'm forgetting the name of the actual park there, but yeah, New York is a success story. So every 2 years, all the people working on piping plovers in the Atlantic coast and some people from the Great Lakes go to this big meeting in West Virginia at the National Conservation Training Center, and we share notes. And it's a really great conservation community. Actually, everyone works nicely together, which is not true of every species I've ever worked on. But yeah, it's we do workshops and we learn new techniques and we share our information. But at the beginning, everyone reports on like what happened last year, and New York was doing well. So.
And that's it for online. I've got one question. With the lens of climate change and sort of looking at the change in, I guess, suitable nest sites, are there any projections or thoughts on how that will change the population dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, nothing that I've seen for like the lakes, because the focus has been on sea level rise. So there's a lot and this is what I mean, again, like the plover community on the Atlantic coast, they've got, they formed a partnership several years ago with Woods Hole, with the coastal geologists. So those guys are good at modeling what happens with water and sand. And they just worked with, actually the lab I was at Virginia Tech, to couple plover habitat needs with their hydrological and geological models to project plover habitat under different scenarios of sea level rise. And basically, they showed this when I was at the West Virginia meeting recently, and it looked much more optimistic for Long Island up to Maine, and pretty terrible from New Jersey down to Virginia, which is why I was saying, like, I was wondering if that's why Virginia is starting to falter with no other real explanation. And the other mystery about Virginia is that the least tern population, so on the Atlantic coast, pretty much everywhere you get piping plovers, you also get least tern colonies, and they're expanding in Virginia, and so it really, if it's habitat, it would probably be foraging areas, because the terns don't care about the mudflats. They feed offshore on fish, but the plovers don't do well if there's no foraging habitat near the nesting areas. So yeah, but there's actually, I don't have them all memorized, but there's pretty detailed models showing like what the barrier islands on the Atlantic coast are going to do over the course of the next 50 years and where the plover habitat would be expected to be on them. They did it like, here's the scenario if people retreat from the coast. Here's the scenario if they suddenly build tons of cement walls. And I have my guess as to what they're going to do, but
Great. Well, that's it for questions.
thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. This was wonderful. Piping plovers are one of my favorite birds.
Oh, good. Me too.
Yeah, so this was great to be able to hear so much about them. All right, well, it's time to socialize. So by all means, have a cookie, have some